We had our first visioning session this past Saturday, and I wanted to take an opportunity to connect with our parish family to talk about a bit about why I think it is so important for us to be having some really intentional conversations over the next little while as it relates to how we live and move and understand ourselves as a church family. I apologize that the sound is not working as it does on a Sunday morning, and so I'm hoping that you can hear me okay, but rest assured that everything that I say today is going to also be sent out in a written document that you're able to take the time to read as well. I'm going to send this video and the document out along with a slideshow of the presentation that was made by the congregational coaches last Saturday. I would really encourage you to read through those slides and then to respond to what you're going to hear today. So I'm going to be attending a clergy day in the next little while, and it's going to be facilitated by someone named, a priest named the Reverend Canon Stephanie Spellers. And in this clergy day that I'm going to be going, she's going to be focusing on her book that's called The Church Cracked Open. So obviously the first thing I did when I heard I had to go to a clergy day and that it was going to focus on this was I ran out and purchased the book so I had a sense of what she would be talking about. And I'd like to share a little bit from the opening words of that book with you this morning. She says, "It was Saturday, August 1st, 2020. I know because my text log tells me so. That afternoon I wrote to a friend, God is breaking open this church and pouring us out. Pouring out privilege, pouring out empire, pouring out racism and human arrogance in order to remake us and use us to serve God's dream for the whole world." She says, "We are the broken jar. It hurts and it sucks." But she also says, "I think it's a gift." That this is a gift to the church. That this time we find ourselves in is a gift to the church. Now, when Stephanie said those words, as she goes on to say, she said, "We were 6 months into a global pandemic and economic collapse. It had been half a year since faith communities could fully gather together for prayer, for worship, for service, for fellowship. Many churches were flooded with need just as donations began to dry up. And our most reliable volunteers were locked away for fear of COVID-19. For 6 months, people had been dying, sometimes more than 1,000 a day in America. A disproportionate number of them Black, Latina, and Indigenous people, whose lives the nation had long ago deemed expendable. We were 2 months from the horror of watching Minnesota police officer Derek Chauvin pin his knee on George Floyd's neck and squeeze the breath of life out of him. 2 months into ongoing protests and truth-telling, reading groups, and deep grief for people of every race, but especially for Blacks, Indigenous, Latina, and Asian people. 2 months shouting to God, "How long, Lord, will you forget us forever? Must we have sorrow in our hearts all the day? How long shall our enemy be exalted over us?" Psalm 13. Now, Stephanie goes on to say that in the scope of human life, 2 months or even 6 months isn't that long. She says that by the time you read these words, it may be a year or 2 or 10 since these cataclysmic events. It might be years since the ending of the COVID pandemic. It might be years since we participated in the Black Lives Rally movement. It might be years since the discovery of the unmarked graves. Others disasters might have eclipsed them entirely. She says, I don't know. What I do know is that as this particular season that we find ourselves in, as this particular season of COVID, of truth and reconciliation, of Black Lives Matter, as this particular season wore on, she said she felt something different. She said that others described the shift as well. And here is what they noticed. And this is pertaining particularly to life in the church. She said, here's what we noticed. First, loss and uncertainty are nothing new for the church. America and civic institutions and churches that once rested comfortably at the center of society had actually suffered disruption, decline, and displacement. They had been experiencing all of those things for decades before 2020. Second, this COVID brought us into a new phase of disruption and decline, particularly in the church. This was a new phase, a steeper drop, a more profound disruption and displacement. For more than a generation, people had been speaking of the church's need to let go of our buildings, that the church is so much more than a building. For generations, for years, we had been talking about that. But now, in the reality of COVID, we were literally unable to congregate inside our sanctuaries in any significant numbers. And we're still in that situation today. Churches that once balked at a screen in the sanctuary were suddenly reconstructing church in cyberspace. Experts, scholars, and preachers agreed that this overall moment in American life was unlike anything most of us had previously ever faced. Past experiences of disruption, past difficult times in the life of the church could be likened to a winter storm or maybe even a blizzard. But we were now, and we are now, in something like an extended winter season. We might even picture it as an ice age that we wonder if it will ever end. The usual institutional church patterns and practices, they don't work in the midst of this ice age we find ourselves living in. It's time to act not like the institutional church that we have always known and loved. It is time for us to learn to embrace acting like a church as a startup company. We must learn to be church in new and different ways. Those words have resonated with me because they help me to understand what I think we have all been experiencing as a church throughout COVID. Because we have indeed been disrupted. Everything is different. And in many ways, we have been responding to it. We have been responding to it by trying to find ways to make our experience of church fit in this new reality that we find ourselves in. We have been trying to fit a round peg into a square hole. We have been trying to make small adjustments to the way we have always done things in the church, to weather this storm of disruption that COVID has unleashed on us. We have made those small adjustments to the ways we have always done things in hope that we might someday be able to return to normal once COVID is over. But for one thing, COVID may never be over. And even if it does come to an end, the landscape of the world we are living in has been changed forever. And two, if we are honest, we have been grieving the decline of the church, both in terms of numbers that show up on a Sunday morning, but also in terms of relevance and influence in society. We have been grieving this decline for years. And so simply returning to the way things were prior to COVID is not going to change that reality. We find ourselves at a crossroads where we know, if we're honest, we know that we simply cannot continue as we always have been. And yet at the same time, we do not know how to live and be church in a different way yet. We do not yet know the way forward. Some have likened the past year and a half. Some have called it our wilderness time. Life in the wilderness for the Israelites was totally different than it was for them back at home in Jerusalem. And the same is true for us. The way we have always done things back at home before COVID will not work out here in the wilderness that we find ourselves living in. We are no longer the church that is at the center of society. We are now a church that is living on the edge with God. And we do not yet know how to live out here on the edges of society. We do not yet know how to be church on the margins. This is a scary time for the church, but it also has the potential. It also has the potential to be an absolutely exciting time for the church as well. We are being invited to renew our commitment that we made in baptism. We are being invited to renew our commitment to putting our trust completely in God, to provide direction and to provide the things that we need, something the Israelites learned the hard way. We are being called to put our trust in God to provide for the things that we need in order to survive this wilderness time that we find ourselves in. We are being called to embrace uncertainty and loss. We are being called to humbly recenter and reorient our life as a church community on the margins of society. Which, if you think about it, that's probably where we should have been acting and living and serving all along. In this moment in the history of the life of the church, we are being called upon to redefine what is holy, to redefine what is worship, to redefine what it means and what it is to make us followers of Jesus. This wilderness is unknown to us, and we are not likely to find our way anytime soon. There is no denying the truth. We desperately need God to show us the way through. All of these thoughts are what has led me to the realization that despite the fact that St. Jude's went through a time of visioning back when you were looking for a new priest, All of these thoughts have made me realize that we once again find ourselves in a moment of disruption in the life of our church family. And we need to once again prayerfully discern what it means for us to be the church in this part of London, Ontario, and what that looks like as we seek to be faithful to the way of Jesus in the context we now find ourselves in. So that is why I invited the congregational coaches, a group of people from the diocese who are trained in helping congregations do this kind of work. This is why I invited the congregational coaches to work with our congregation to help us to think and to pray about these things, and to do some visioning and some dreaming about who God might be calling us to be, and what God might be calling us to focus on in the world today. We had our first session with the coaches last Saturday, and something that got said very early on in the day has really stuck with me. One of the coaches said that what their role was. They said that they were here to help us as a congregation to figure out three things. As a church community, what do we stand on? What do we build on? What do we move on from? Three things. What do we stand on? What are the things that make us who we are here at St. Jude's? What ministries are the most fulfilling to us? What ministries do we excel at? What ministries do we find the most life-giving? What ministries have the biggest impact on our congregation and the community around us? So what is it that we stand on as a church community here at St. Jude's? Second, what do we build on? What could we do better? Either improving upon existing ministries or responding to God's call to engage in new things that better fit with the world we are living in today. What ministries can we build on? What new ministries can we introduce? And then third, what do we move on from? Are there things we have always done? Are there ways that we have always been and understood who we are as the church? Are there things that have always been that way that are no longer life-giving? Are there things that we do in this place that we no longer have the resources to engage in or the energy to keep going with? Can we possibly give ourselves permission to let go of these things and create energy, resources, and space to engage in ministries that are better suited to who we are today, that are better suited to the world we are living in today? Now, I've been calling this process that we'll be participating in with the congregational coaches, I've been calling it visioning. But in fact, I think we already have the vision of who we want to be at St. Jude's. I think we already know our vision. Our vision in this place is rooted in the 5 marks of mission. And the 5 marks of mission are, to remind you, are 1, to proclaim the good news of the kingdom of God. That's at the heart of who we are at St. Jude's. 2, to teach, baptize, and nurture new believers. That needs to be at the heart of who we are at St. Jude's. 3, to respond to human need by loving service. Again, that is at the heart of who we are at St. Jude's. 4, to seek to transform unjust structures of society. 5, to strive to safeguard the integrity of creation and sustain and renew the face of the earth. I believe that our vision as the community of St. Jude's here in London, Ontario, I believe that our vision is to be a community who faithfully strives to live out these 5 marks of mission. So what I think, if we already have the vision, what I think this process with the congregational coaches will be focused on is about helping us to discern and helping us to set some doable goals. To help us to set goals accompanied by an accountable action plan that will help St. Jude's to more effectively bring that vision into reality. How can we at St. Jude's live out our vision of striving to be faithful to the 5 marks of mission? Again, what do we stand on? What is it that we are already doing that helps us to live out the 5 marks of mission in an effective and life-giving way? What do we build on? What are we already doing that we might build on to more effectively be able to live out the 5 marks of mission? What new ministries might we dream of doing that will help us to engage the world around us and live out the 5 marks of mission effectively? And what is it that we need to move on from? What are the things that we might need to move on from in order to free up some resources, in order to free up some energy, so that we might more effectively live out these 5 marks of mission? I would really like to encourage each and every member of our church family to take the time to read through the slides from the presentation we had from the congregational coaches last Saturday. And then I would encourage all of you to prayerfully reflect on those 3 questions. What do we stand on? What do we build on? What do we need to move on from? I would then encourage you to write down at least one response to each of those questions and email them to me at billward@diohuron.org, and I will email out that address so that you could submit your responses. In addition to responding to those 3 questions, I would also ask you to do some dreaming and submit one goal or one dream that you have for St. Jude's. Is there something that you have been thinking would be a great ministry for us to get involved in? Is there a different way of doing things that you think might work better? Are there things that maybe we shouldn't be doing anymore that you don't think we should be doing? It could be a goal that builds on something we're already doing. It could be a goal that is dreaming of an entirely new ministry. But I want you to think about one particular goal that you think we could do at St. Jude's that would more effectively help us to live out our vision of being faithful to the 5 marks of mission. While you are dreaming about a goal for St. Jude's, keep in mind, goals and things that we can dream of doing, they need to be realistic. They need to be doable. We need to have the money and the people resources and the time and the energy to be able to engage in those things. Don't let that keep you from dreaming, but dream and think of your goals in light of them needing to be realistic for who we are as a church family and where we are situated in our society today. May we learn to once again, through this process, may we learn to once again listen for the voice of God in the thoughts and the suggestions that get made. May we trust that God will be faithful, that God will indeed provide St. Jude's with new direction, that God will provide us with the things that we need as we learn to embrace the uncertainty we find ourselves in, as we learn to grieve and continue to grieve the loss of the church that we knew and loved for most of our lives. May we learn to trust that God will be faithful to us as we seek to recenter our common life together, redefining what it means to be church, redefining what is holy, what is worship, what makes us a follower of Jesus, and what it means to be church in 2021.